Hello and good evening, everybody. My name's Jason from the Class Consciousness Project, and good evening, everyone joining us on this live stream. If you've been on this channel before, then you may have seen me before introducing our class struggle updates. We haven't done a class struggle update for some time, and what we thought we'd do as a slight change is to do a live stream to talk about trade unionism, specifically my experiences of trade unionism in the 34 years that I was involved in the trade union movement. Now, some of you might be wondering why we haven't had a class struggle update for some time. And part of the reason for that is that there hasn't been much in the way of class struggle to report in some time. If you've been watching our streams in the recent past, you'll see that I've reported on the collapse of the Royal Mail dispute with the Communication Workers Union, the collapse of the nurses dispute with the Royal College of Nursing, and the collapse of the teachers dispute with the National Education Union, which left me in a bit of a bind with regards to creating videos to put out updating your class struggle, because there's currently really only two major disputes now continuing in Britain. The first is ASLEF strikes and ongoing dispute on the railways, and the RMT's strikes and ongoing dispute on the railways. So there isn't very much to report on. But what I wanted to talk to you tonight about was my time in the trade union movement. And before anyone gets too worried about how long I've got to talk about 34 years in the trade union movement, what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and split this up into two halves. The first half will be a potted history of my time from 1989, when I first joined a trade union, to 2020. And then the second half will be a more detailed look at the last almost 4 years and why I ended up speaking to you now on the 24th of October 2023, not in a trade union, and not in a trade union for the first time since the 9th of August 1989. So I hope you find the discussion interesting. I hope you find it illuminating. There may be bits of it that are slightly, in terms of a mea culpa for me, a bit of self-reflection, maybe a little self-criticism as well. But you're always welcome to add your comments in the live chat, and I'll pick up on any comments and questions as we go along. So let me take you back in time. I joined my current employer on a youth training scheme, which was an old scheme that the government, the Thatcher government as it was then, used to run to try and encourage employers to get kids who were not going to technical college, not going to sixth form college, or not going into any other form of higher education. It was a way of getting them into employment. And I joined my employer when I was 16 years old on a youth training scheme. And 2 days after I joined on the Monday, and on the Wednesday, we were all given an induction by a representative of the National Union of Railwaymen. The National Union of Railwaymen was the main rail union at the time, and is in its current guise, which I'll come to in a moment. So we all signed up. There were one or two members of our group, bearing in mind we'd only been on the job a total of 3 days, or we're into our third day. One or two members of the group whose parents, specifically fathers, were already on London Underground, and they had raised issues about what was called the Wildcat strikes. Now, the Wildcat strikes took place in 1989 and were a dispute over pay for train drivers. And one or two of the people in the group were aggrieved on behalf of their dads, because they said that the union didn't offer as much help as they could have. But putting that to one side, as I recall, virtually everyone in the group signed up to the National Union of Railwaymen. And shortly after that, about, if memory serves me right, just a little over a year after we all signed up for the National Union of Railwaymen, the NUR merged with the National Union of Seamen to become the National Union of Railway, Maritime and Transport Workers, better known to everyone as the RMT. And I was an RMT member continuously from 1989 until about 1995 without getting active in the movement. I was your typical common or garden rank and file subs paying member and didn't get very much involved. Only really got my diary from the union and nothing else. And that was until roughly 1995 when I started to develop an interest in becoming more involved in my trade union. And I was talking to colleagues on the line where I worked about getting more involved and possibly becoming a rep, and was encouraged to go to my branch meeting. And my branch meeting at the time, the branch used to meet in Leytonstone in East London. And it was there that I was very lucky enough to meet Bob Crow. And Bob Crow at the time, the late great Bob Crow, at the time was the Assistant General Secretary of the RMT. The General Secretary at the time was a guy called Jimmy Knapp. And Jimmy Knapp was an old school railwayman, for want of a better word. He was a railwayman and he joined as a box boy, which was a colloquial term for a 16-year-old trainee who worked in a signal box. And what they used to do, amongst other things, was sweep up the cabin, clean book trains as they went through and so on. And that's how he started in the railways. And he developed a long career in the railways and then eventually become part of the RMT infrastructure and then become its general secretary. So I was very fortunate at quite a young age to get to know, in a small way, Bob Crow, because Bob Crow was a member of my branch. And Bob was always a very good speaker, be it in branch meetings or on rostrums at conferences and so on. And he always had an ability to hold a room in the palm of his hand when he spoke. It was a gift that he had. And also, he was a very good guy to talk with one-to-one. I remember my first disciplinary when I became a rep was a frankly open and shut case. And it was going to be very, very difficult for me to defend the guy and hopefully keep his job. And it was my first disciplinary. And sadly, I wasn't able to save them and save their job. And they were summarily dismissed. And I remember going back to the branch the following week, kind of crestfallen, feeling very sorry for myself and feeling that I'd failed. And I remember Bob saying to me at the time, he said, look, at the end of the day, you can only do what you do. You can only say what you say, but ultimately it's the management that sacked them. And that always stayed with me and helped me as I grew as a rep over the years. And a lot of what you learn about being a rep is on the job training, and a lot of it is on the job failures, a lot of on the job setbacks. But it was then that I thought, yeah, I think the trade union movement is somewhere I want to be, and it's somewhere I want to be more involved. And so it was, and I remained in the RMT for quite some time. But I think the pivotal moment for me in terms of my relationship with the RMT and how it becomes slightly more rocky over the years was in about 1997 when I moved to a new workplace. And the workplace I moved into was quite militant. It was known outside of its four walls for being quite a militant workplace. When there was industrial action, everyone was out, everybody, without exception. Even the non-members were out because it was better for them to go out than it was to come in and face the wrath of their colleagues when everyone else come back to work. And it was quite a big step up for me going to this new workplace. It was touch and go whether I was going to make it through the training, but I did manage to do it. And after settling myself in for a couple of years, I thought I'd try my hand again at being a rep, because by dint of moving locations, I had to stand down as a rep on the line I was on previous. And I was always advised by people who knew much better than me, don't become a rep in a job that you don't understand. So learn the job first, and then you can become a rep, because you're always going to be a target as a rep. And the best way that the management can target you is if you're not very good at your job. So a couple of years after I went to my new location, I became a local rep, and I did find myself for many years as a rep butting horns with certain influencers, shall we say, for want of a better word, who worked at the same place as I did. Found myself disagreeing on many things with them, and I found myself trying to sell something to the members that the members often weren't interested in buying, and often finding myself carrying messages from the members that I wasn't happy with carrying. So it was quite a tumultuous time. And through a period of um, regrading, roster rows, and all kinds of other things, I found myself in a position where I felt it was only appropriate to step down. And that was in 2001. I decided to stand down and frankly let someone else do it, because by then I pretty much burnt myself out as a rep. Because it can, and ask any rep and they'll tell you, it can get quite relentless being a rep, and there's very little respite. And so I took a break, enjoyed sitting back, enjoyed criticising other reps now for not being as good as I was, at least what I thought I was. And perhaps somewhat foolishly, after about 18 months, if memory serves, I decided to have another tilt at coming back as a rep. And I did it for a couple of years, and again found myself struggling with the internal politics of where I was, the conflicts of interest that I was facing in the room, and the difficulties in trying to reason between both the management and the members. And I decided again to stand down. And that was it. I didn't return as a rep for the RMT again. And then the whole function that I worked in went through a reorganization in around about 2004. And for some reason, I was invited by a colleague who had become the rep after I stood down and asked me to attend a meeting that was taking place to discuss this reorganization. And I thought it was odd because I wasn't an active rep. Obviously, once you get to a certain level within a trade union, you always maintain a level of interest in that trade union and the workings of that particular section or that particular role. But I thought it was strange that I was being asked back, given that it was a slightly acrimonious end to my last term. But I went along anyway. And the impression I got watching, bearing in mind there was a number of reps from the RMT around this table. And then there was one rep from the train drivers union, ASLEF, even though we weren't train drivers, there was a train drivers rep there because of the legacy of managers coming from the train driver grade. So ASLEF had representation rights there. And also someone from the Transport Salaried Staffs Association, TSSA, which is a predominantly white collar transport and travel union. There was a rep there. And the first impression I got going into this meeting was that it was clear to me, although I couldn't know this for certain, it appeared, at least on its face, that there had been no coordination of these RMT reps before they went into this meeting. And so what ended up happening was you had lots of reps fighting to protect their piece of turf in front of the management. And the penny kind of dropped for me. I realized why I'd been asked in, because I was, at least in the view of the person who invited me to come along, able to hopefully cut through some of this rather partisan approach to negotiations and maybe try and bring all the reps together. Well, as it was, I only went to one meeting. And as it was, the deal that was agreed was not satisfactory to many RMT members. And if memory serves, we're going back to 2004 now, so 19 years ago. And the RMT had found itself reaching something of a dead end in terms of negotiating this settlement. And so the members were balloted for strike action, and the members responded. They said that they wanted to take strike action. And the members and the hierarchy of the union thought it'd be a rather natty idea to have a strike on New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve in London, one of the busiest days in the entire calendar year. And given the roles that we performed, we could bring the underground to a near standstill, if not complete standstill, on New Year's Eve. And so we were marched up to the top of the hill. We were all up for it, all up for the strike. Meanwhile, discussions were taking place in the background to try to reach a settlement. And we found ourselves with a strike that would have been, in my view, given that it was New Year's Eve, would have been very, very heavily supported. They wouldn't have had to put a picket line anywhere, because telling people they can have New Year's off is an open and shut. That's pushing an open door to someone who is in a union who has the option to have the night off, albeit losing pay, but they still have the option for the night off. And the strike was postponed. In fact, it was cancelled. And we were told that they had reached a new deal with the management. Our threat of strike action had yielded results, and we were all called back to the RMT's head office, which was, or is, in Charlton Street, which is not far from Euston Station, to have a pour over this deal. And if I remember right, and I'm pretty sure I do, the deal was no different to the one that we were going to go on strike for. So the offer that the management had made was not satisfactory. We were going to go on strike. The RMT went back into talks, came back with the same deal, or at least on its face the same deal, and called the strike off. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of very, very angry people at these meetings, and they held a series of meetings throughout the day. And as I understand it, the tone of the meetings was roughly the same. They felt they'd been sold out. The members had been sold out by the RMT. And reflecting on it now, and having reflected on it a few years after it happened, it all sort of dropped into place. The key pivotal figure, although he may not have had any direct dealings with this, but the key pivotal figure was Ken Livingstone. Ken Livingstone was the mayor of London at the time, and it was felt by some senior members of the RMT, senior bureaucrats at the RMT, including those of the Trotskyite persuasion, that the last thing that we should do is sully the good name of Ken Livingstone, who was a good old-fashioned Labour man, in order that we could have a better deal. And it was probably my first experience, my first direct experience of the fealty that some people in the trade union movement pay to the Labour Party, which I will come on to later on. But it was the fact that the future of the Mayor of London was considered more important than the members who were in dispute, left a very nasty taste in my mouth. And I found myself in a bit of a quandary, because I didn't really want to continue to be in a union that would treat its members like that. But in the industry that I work in, there aren't many options in terms of trade unions. And so I found myself with two options, really. One was to, well, obviously three. Let's call it three options. The first one was to stay in the RMT. The second was to join the Associated Society of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen, ASLEF. I have never been a train driver, and I've never aspired to be one. I'm sure it's an honourable profession, but it's not something that I've ever done. My vocation is somewhat different. And so the only union at the time that I thought could fit for me was the white collar union, the Transport Salaried Staffs Association. And so I decided to sign up. And there was a period, a few months, where I was swinging between TSSA and the RMT and back again, because I really wasn't sure what to do. I really wasn't sure where I wanted to go. And what was in the back of my mind throughout all of it was that whatever decision I made, I had to make it stick. I wasn't going to be flip-flopping between two unions, depending on which way the wind was blowing. I was going to either stick with the RMT or I was going to stick with TSSA. And I had some discussions with some senior reps within the RMT who momentarily persuaded me to come back to the RMT. But I must be honest, I did see the writing on the wall, and I decided that that was enough for me. And I decided to leave the RMT for good and join the TSSA. And I must be absolutely honest, the welcome I got at the TSSA when I switched unions in around about 2005 was a very warm one. There was more than a few people who knew that I'd already been a rep for the RMT, who were quite enthusiastic about persuading me to try and become a rep for TSSA. I said, well, look, I want to get myself settled in to my new union first, try and work out how it works. Obviously, knowing how the RMT works doesn't necessarily follow that TSSA works the same way, and it didn't. It was subtly different. And so I became a TSSA member, got myself settled in, and then a colleague of mine who was also a rep for TESA working in the same location as I was had decided through ill health that they would stand down and the position become vacant. And I thought, I think I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go for it. So I went to my branch meeting and I was nominated, seconded, and elected. And I become a TSSA rep in the function that I work in, not a local rep, a functional rep. And I did that job for what ended up being 7 years. 7 years. And during that time, obviously going through meetings and networking through the internal structures of the union, I managed to get myself quite well known amongst people within the wider family of the same organisation that I work in. And in 2010, having done the reps job for about 5 years, and I think, if I do say so myself, I built up a pretty solid reputation as a rep. I was asked by colleagues in my branch if I wanted to take a tilt at running for the executive committee position for the region that I work in. And I mulled it over for a little while, and to be honest, wasn't really sure what it involved. I wasn't really sure what I had to do. But I thought, well, if people have got faith in me, maybe I'll give it a go. Let's see what happens. And at the same time, I was elected to serve on the Standing Orders Committee of my union's annual conference. And for those that don't know, it goes via different names, but the Standing Orders Committee in my union at the time was a body of people who essentially planned the schedule and the motions that would be tabled at conference, so the annual conference. Sometimes it will be called the Conference Arrangements Committee, but ours was called the Standing Orders Committee. And so I got to see the administrative side of trade unionism as well, and I really enjoyed my time. It was a three or 4 days. It was up in Norwich, where our conference was taking place, sorry, that was in 2011. Beg your pardon, 2011. We was in Norwich, and that's where I was on the SOC, and I really enjoyed myself. Now, around about that time, the election for executive committee was taking place, and I was in a field of 4, and the election came in, and I had lost. I finished, I think it was 3rd, if I remember rightly, out of 4. However, there had been an error in the paperwork that they had sent out to the members. So part of the election process was you would write a biography, which basically says who you are, where you work, where you've been, and any trade union experience or any other relevant experience you want to list. And then the next bit was an election statement. And my election statement had a whole paragraph missing when it was published with the rest of the election paperwork. And so my colleagues in the branch put together an emergency motion to call for a reballot, rerun the election because of this administrative error. And there was a long adjournment at conference, which I remember very well. And then I was told they're rerunning the ballot. because of the mistake. Now, in the first election, I had done as much as I could with my limited technical knowledge at the time. So I just sent out some emails. I knocked up some very rough posters. It wasn't very spectacular, but it was something. When they reran the election, I went hell for leather. I sent posters, I sent emails, I did shot after shot after shot. I didn't stop until the day the ballot closed. And I won the election by 3 votes. And I was elected to the executive committee of the TSSA. And because of the delay taking the position, because you would normally take the position in July, I didn't get the position until October. And because the first meeting that I should have been on clashed with another commitment, I missed that one, which meant the next TSSA meeting, EC meeting, was going to be in December 2011. So that ended up being my first meeting. And it was an incredible inaugural meeting. And the reason why it was an inaugural meeting that was incredible, at least for me, was because it was my first ever experience of being on an executive committee. And it was a joint meeting of the RMT and TSSA executive committees to discuss a possible merger. And I remember we were in the very grand ballroom at RMT's head office, Unity House. I remember the meeting was chaired by the then president, who is now the president, Alex Gordon. Alex was the president, stepped off and came back, but he was the chair then. He was chairing that meeting, and Bob Crow spoke. And Bob Crow spoke about how his vision of what this merged union would be a brand new union. A brand new union. It wouldn't be RMT plus, it wouldn't be TSSA plus, it would be a brand new union, starting from scratch. And I was very, having known Bob before, of course, very taken with what he said, totally agree with what he said. I was quite enthusiastic about what he said. And there was a lot of, without saying naming names and saying what they said, but there was a lot of naysayers amongst the RMT executive, a lot of hostility towards any sort of merger with TSSA. And it was something I remember seeing firsthand when I was in Great Yarmouth at the RMT's AGM, a certain hostility towards TSSA. Now, I must confess, back in 1997, when I was in Great Yarmouth, I hadn't even heard of the TSSA. I didn't even know who they were. And as my time on that particular AGM, or the course that was running in the background behind the AGM that I was attending, as that went on, it was at least obvious to me at the time that TSSA was fundamentally an office staff and booking clerk union. So it was a white collar back office booking office type union. And that was all the thought I gave it. I didn't give it anymore. But sitting in that executive committee meeting, there were some people around that table for the RMT who were openly hostile to the TSSA. And so what we came out of that meeting with was a sense that it could be done. A merger could be made with the RMT, but there were a lot of red lines for certain executive committee members, one of which was the Labour Party. Now, I'll come on to the Labour Party in a bit more detail later on, but the fundamental difference at the time in 2011 between the RMT and the TSSA regarding the Labour Party was that the TSA was affiliated to the Labour Party. The RMT had been thrown out of the Labour Party. And briefly, they were thrown out because in Scotland, a Scottish branch backed a Scottish Socialist Party candidate in I believe it was a council election. If anyone knows any better, do say. But it was to do with that. That was in breach of Labour's rules. The RMT refused to back down, and so they were kicked out by the Labour Party, and they've been kicked out ever since. And in fact, a few years ago, they had a special annual general meeting, an extraordinary general meeting, I should say, where they discussed the matter of reaffiliation, and it was dismissed by the membership. So people have got long memories in the RMT. And to be fair, I don't blame them for not reaffiliating. I'll explain more later on. But I'm sure there would have been some people there that were still very sore about the way it ended in the first place, and perhaps they saw nothing from the Labour Party in the 15, 20 years that had followed that made them think they were worth rejoining. So that was my inaugural meeting. I settled quite well into the role, found myself growing in confidence. The first few meetings, I remember saying very little, but listening a lot and writing lots of things down. Then I managed to build networks with people, other people on the executive committee, who were like-minded, same sort of mindset as me. And I found myself really growing into the role and really enjoying it. It must be said, though, there are limitations to being an executive committee member. The closer to the very top of a union you get, the harder it is to influence anything, which is slightly counterintuitive, but it's absolutely true. You feel more forced to follow a certain line when you're at that level, whereas you're less fettered the further down the structure you go. But I had a very informative, educational, and very enjoyable roughly 3 years. I say roughly 3 years because my term still ended in July 2014. And as I approached that July in 2014, I weighed up, because it was quite a tumultuous period. There was a lot of fighting between senior reps in the area that I work and certain dignitaries of the union, which I was caught in the crossfire of. And I got to 2014 and decided that I would not seek a second term. I was entitled to run for a second term, but I decided not to. So in 2014, I stood down from the executive at the end of my term and was enjoying just being a rep again, just being a rep. And then I got a telephone call from a colleague who I had served alongside on the executive, and he asked me quite bluntly, as he was wont to do. He said, "Do you fancy being treasurer of the union?" Now, to explain the treasurer position in the TSSA, it's essentially the vice president role. The story of it is quite interesting, though. How the role came about is quite interesting. I'll briefly explain. So I'll go all the way back to 1906. 1906, the responsibility of the finances was the sole purview of the General Secretary of the TSSA then. I believe it was the Railway Clerks Association then. The man's name was John Stopford Challoner, and his responsibility not only to be the General Secretary was to look after the purse strings, which all worked well for the first 9 years of the union's life until Mr. Stopford Challoner nicked all the money, ran off to Paris and killed himself. And the union had to rebuild itself again, having had John Stopford Challoner empty the piggy bank, spend it on God knows what, and then top himself. So the new General Secretary was a chap called Alexander Walton, who eventually became Lord Walton, as is often the case with General Secretaries of trade unions. But to Alexander Walton's credit, he rebuilt the union. And one of the things that he did as part of that rebuilding program was to establish a role of treasurer. And the treasurer was a lay position. That means it was someone who was elected from the membership. It wasn't an appointee. It wasn't someone who was employed. They were a volunteer from the lay membership with the sole purpose of managing the finances of the union. Now, when I was elected to the role of treasurer in 2015, I wasn't managing the finances. I had an overview of the finances. I knew where the finances were. I knew how much was in each account, and I knew who to ask if I needed to get any information. But I wasn't sitting there with a great big ledger working out how much we got in members' subs, how much we paid out in wages, and so on. It was very much more an overview role than it was an actual nuts and bolts accounting role, which was good because accounting was not my strong suit. Just see my bank account, you'll know what I mean. But I was elected in 2015, and became a national officer of the union by dint of being the treasurer. And I continued to be the treasurer for 6 years. The treasurer has 2-year terms, much like the president. The president and the treasurer both serve 2-year terms, but you can stand for as many terms as you want. There's no maximum. Whereas with the executive committee, you can stand for a 3-year term, you can stand for a further 3-year term, and then you're done. 6 years is your max and you leave. I got to 2021 and had my mind made up by then for a number of reasons, which I'll go into very shortly. But I decided then that I wasn't going to stand again for the role of treasurer. I'd had 6 years in the role. On the whole, it had been enjoyable, very, again, educational. I enjoyed the responsibility. I enjoyed fielding questions from the floor, at annual conference. Even the hard ones that I wasn't really sure of the answer to, I was hopefully rather good at winging it and getting myself out of it. But I thought after 6 years, and I'll be honest, I would have stood for president if I thought standing for president was on the cards. But given it didn't look to be on the cards, and I'd already been in post for 6 years, I didn't want to be in post for 8, treasurer, and so I decided to stand down. And within a year of standing down, I'd left the union completely. And that brings us on to the second half of what I'm going to talk about today, the reasons why I left and what brings me to where I am now, which is a man who's not in a trade union for the first time in 34 years. But I'll go through some of your comments. So in the chat, I say hi to James and to Ricky, and hi to Philbin. Hope you're all well. So to answer Ricky's question, was that hostility due to tribalism and fear of change? Okay, the joke that used to happen or used to be told in the RMT when they were talking about TSSA stood for too scared to say anything. The TSSA had a reputation, whether it was earned or not, of capitulating in front of management, never taking strike action. In fact, there had been instances where members had complained. In fact, I think I may be wrong here, but I think there was an instance where they raised a case with the High Court to prevent a strike. A member took the TSSA to court. I may have that wrong. I'm prepared to be shot down in flames on that, but I do remember hearing rumours about that happening. And the RMT was always, as the NUR was before it, a militant trade union. Always was a militant trade union, and they saw TSSA's approach to be anathema to those, to the point where you had an antagonism, particularly coming from the RMT to TSSA, not so much the other way around. And that was why the RMT were not fans, in fact, aren't fans to this day of the TSSA. Philbin says, thank you for your videos and hard work, comrade. In the States, notice phenomenon of primary militantly socialist challenges within unions, unfortunately, comes from trots. Yeah, well, yeah. I might touch on the influence of Trotskyism in the trade union movement later on. The British Trotskyite movement in this country seems to have this idea that the best way to influence a trade union is to ascend its structures to the highest level possible. And as I said earlier on, and I stand by the point, the further up a trade union structure you go, the harder it is to influence anything, because the more you are corralled into holding the party line, including things like Labour Party affiliation, positions on the European Union, which I'll talk about shortly, and all kinds of other things. It's very, very hard to be a radical or to be a cheeky nonconformist at the very highest level. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying it's very, very difficult. Very difficult. Whereas when you are a rank and file member, a foot soldier, if you like, you have greater reign to change policy provided you can do it at your annual general meeting or your annual conference. That's when you can bloody notice. That's when you can really stir things up far more effectively at the ground roots level than you can at the top level. That's my personal opinion. If you are watching and you've been an executive committee member yourself and you've got a different opinion, I'm happy to hear it. But that's my view, speaking as someone who was on an executive committee for a total of 9 years. So we'll move on to the second bit now, second bit of this live stream, where I'm going to break down now my journey from roughly 2020, I think we'll call it, to me leaving the union, the TSSA, in July of 2022. And there were a number of reasons for it, but I think 2020 is a nice, neat place to start because we all know what happened in 2020, which was COVID. So I remember vividly this disease breaking out in Italy and lots of people falling ill, quite a few people dying, and it was looking like it was on its way to us. And I do remember discussions going, no, it won't come here, it won't come here. I'm not exactly sure what scientific reasons they thought there were for it not to come here, but come here it did. And if you recall what happened at the beginning of COVID, the rumours, which persist to this day, was that Boris Johnson, who was the Prime Minister at the time, had a slightly more libertarian outlook with regards to dealing with COVID, which was essentially to let the disease blow through the population whilst protecting the most vulnerable, which in a manner of speaking is exactly what the Great Barrington Declaration ended up becoming. That was his libertarian instincts, if you like, coming to the fore, and him saying, well, we'll just let this blow through, we'll protect the most vulnerable, and jobs are good. What ended up happening, excuse me while I turn my heater back on, it's a bit chilly in here. What ended up happening, and he speaks to Boris Johnson's inability to have a view of his own. He has a view on something that was basically what the last person told him was a view on it. He ended up getting kiboshed by people, including Neil Ferguson, who told him that if you don't lock down, it'll be Armageddon and you'll have to count the bodies and pile them up and you'll be burying them forever. And he panicked. He got caught in a panic. He was given all these models of how many people were going to catch the disease, how many people were going to die, how soon the NHS was going to get overwhelmed and so on. And he panicked and he locked us down. And the lockdown, depending on what line of business you were in and what your job was, determined how COVID affected you. Now, of course, bearing in mind, I was in the TSSA being ostensibly a white-collar union, organising people. They do organise frontline staff, of course, on the stations and so on, but they organise a lot of back office staff as well. And with lockdowns coming, these offices were closed down. And the workers that were put in them were sent home to do their work from home on laptops. And I think it was around about then that my faith in the trade union movement started to wane a little bit. And the reason is this. I understand how people were in February 2020. We were terrified. I absolutely get that. I was worried. I was convinced I was going to get COVID and ended up changing my whole lifestyle so that if I did get it, it wouldn't kill me. But that was in February, March, April of 2020. The union movement in general acted in an opportunistic manner, in my view, when dealing with COVID. I believe they saw it as a good way to leverage concessions from employers. Okay. Not necessarily hand wash and face masks, but to allow people who would have had to go to a place of work to not have to go there anymore. And TSSA was no exception to that. It allowed thousands of its members to work from home, effectively plunging them into a state of semi-retirement, which is all well and good when we had the idea of COVID being this black death that was coming to us early in 2020. The problem was, by around about August, September of 2020, the best way I can put it, the question marks were being raised over masks, lockdowns, and social distancing. We didn't have the vaccines by then, but it was those three steps, and there were questions being asked about the efficacy of those steps. But none of them were coming from the trade union movement. None of them. No critical analysis of what effect lockdowns were having on workers was being carried out by the trade union movement. If anything, the trade union movement wanted harder and longer lockdowns. The problem for a union like TSSA, though, was it was atomising their workforce. Whereas before they were going to places of work, head office buildings where all their members were in the same place, the proverbial talking around the water cooler situation, they were all scattered to the four corners of London and the home counties. They all lost touch with each other. The only way they could keep in touch with each other was on email. All of a sudden, the common problems that they could talk around were gone. And I remember talking to a colleague of mine who was a rep, and she was saying, I don't know why, but no one's going sick anymore. And I said, well, of course they're not going sick. They're working from home. Why would you go sick and have that sickness on your record if you could check emails in bed on your laptop? And that was the problem that the union had created for itself. It had atomised its workforce. It had thrown them to the four corners of London and the home counties and beyond in some cases. And it didn't know how to get them back again. And my union at the time closed its head office. It furloughed its own staff, including some of the organising team. And there were some organisers who weren't furloughed, who, by dint of an agreement that my union at the time had made with GMB, the General Municipal and Boilermakers Union, which represented the staff, made it with them that they could work from home and they didn't have to go out into the field, so to speak. So they didn't have to go out to workplaces or anything like that, which meant that my colleague on Avanti West Coast, who was trying to organise a strike at the end of 2020, had no regional organisers coming to the picket line that she was organising. And I thought that was an absolute disgrace, an absolute disgrace. And I developed a belief around about then that the union, the TSSA, was being run for the staff and not for the members. When people are losing money over the Christmas period on a dispute that had been bubbling up for months, and Avanti West Coast were not a nice employer and still aren't. Ask anyone that works for them. And there they were taking strike action. And because of a ludicrous agreement that the union had made with GMB, no regional organiser was allowed to stand on a picket line with them. And that really stuck in my craw. So the union was all in on the COVID response, the lockdowns, the masks, the testing and all that sort of thing. And I, towards the end of 2020, early 2021, was coming to the understanding that maybe some of the measures that we were taking against COVID were not the most appropriate, or at least there were better ways of doing things, which made me something of an outlier with some of my colleagues. But COVID was where it really started to unravel for me. But it also, thankfully, gave me the chance to get an education. I had more opportunities to work from home, more opportunity to work in a quieter working environment, because the service we were providing then, very early in the days of COVID, was very, very patchy, because obviously we didn't know which staff were being able to come in, which ones had got COVID and so on. But my end of my relationship with the Labour Party coincided roughly with the beginning of COVID hitting the United Kingdom. And I'll talk again more about Labour later on. But I decided to try and educate myself. And one of the first books I picked up and read was a book by a guy called Robert Clough, You may have heard this be mentioned on other live casts. It's called Labour, a Party Fit for Imperialism by Robert Clough, who's of the Revolutionary Communist Group. And I absolutely blitzed this book. I read it in almost no time at all. It's a fantastic read. If you haven't read it, I recommend you do. It explodes almost every single myth about the Labour Party. Every single myth. You know, the party that's dined out on the period between 1945 and 1951, where they gave us the NHS, they nationalised the railways, they nationalised the steel, nationalised the coal, and so on. But my understanding developed from reading that book that all those things that they gave us in 1945 to 1951, they had to, because they had no choice. Revolution was in the air. The example of a successful worker state was on the other side of the map in the form of the Soviet Union. And lots of working class people were returning from service to their country, not wanting a repeat of what happened after the First World War, where David Lloyd George promised them homes fit for heroes and gave them poverty and destitution. So that developed my understanding of the Labour Party and where it fits in with the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, the state, essentially, and how it works. And that's where I went from there. And it's onto the Labour Party now that I'll move on. So, as I said a little while ago, the TSSA was affiliated to the Labour Party. And during the period of early 2020 to the end of that year, obviously, Sir Keir Starmer had been elected as Labour leader. I was on the executive committee when the union decided who to nominate for leader and deputy leader. And I remember all the great and the good, Sir Keir Starmer included, came to a place called Quorn, which is a village in Leicestershire, not far from Loughborough. And we were all in a hotel there, which we did use from time to time, which is owned by the General Federation of Trade Unions. And things were starting to unravel for me as a treasurer. I was starting to become quite disenchanted with the role. And I made a promise to myself that if the executive committee, as a body, decided that they were going to nominate Sir Keir Starmer, I was going to resign as the treasurer. There was no way I was going to have this ruling class stooge be nominated by my union, or at least not, and have me continue as part of it. And whether or not there was mutiny in the air, whether or not the general secretary and the president caught a whiff of something they didn't like the smell of, it was decided quite late on not to allow the executive committee themselves to decide, but have the executive committee endorse a ballot of the members for who they wanted to nominate. And I thought at the time that was a little bit cowardly. I thought if you're going to nominate someone, at least have the balls to do it yourself. Don't hide behind the members, because let's be clear, that does happen. Executive committees and executive committee members, and even reps, sometimes hide behind the membership when they go and do something that is ill-advised, shall we say. So it went out to a ballot of the members, as I suspected it would be. It was a rather paltry turnout. If I remember right, G&B did the same, and I think the turnout was barely 10%, and I think it was similar. I think it was something in the region of 10%, maybe a little more for us. But they decided to nominate Sir Keir Starmer. And I was very, very frustrated by that. I mean, I thought Rebecca Long Bailey, for all her faults, I thought she was excellent when she spoke to the executive committee. I thought she has a moment. She's a bit woolly, I know that. But of all the people that were trying to sell themselves to us, for me, she was the outstanding candidate. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way, and Sir Keir Starmer won. And so began his process of changing the Labour Party from what it was into what it is now, or what it was always, which is a party of imperialism. And the issue that I've always had and always held with TSSA, bearing in mind I was someone who wasn't in the political fund. Now, just to briefly explain, not to go too far of a tangent, when you give money to a union that's affiliated to the Labour Party in terms of your subscriptions, a tiny percentage of it goes into what's called the political fund or the political levy. And the political fund is required by anti-trade union legislation. So unions have to keep the money that they use for political work separate from everything else. And the people that put money into that fund, that political fund, have to endorse that every 10 years. So every 10 years, you will receive a ballot paper saying, do you want to keep the political fund? And the union will go hell for leather to say, please vote yes. Part of that political levy is a further percentage. So we're talking about a small percentage of an even smaller percentage that goes to the Labour Party. And in order that the Labour Party wouldn't see a penny of my money, I left the political fund. Now, I confess I was a member of the Labour Party from 2015 to early 2020. It's a part of my life I do regret somewhat, but I did it and I'm fessing up to it. But yeah, I was a member during Jeremy Corbyn's somewhat disastrous tenure as Labour leader. But when certain people I wanted to stand for leader decided not to and to step back for Rebecca Long-Bailey, and then when Rebecca Long-Bailey ended up becoming the left candidate, I thought, that's it, I'm done. And so I decided to lead the Labour Party, and then, as I said earlier on, develop my understanding of the Labour Party and what it really is. But TSSA was always a steadfast supporter of the Labour Party, come what may. And despite what Sir Keir Starmer had done in 2020, bearing in mind in that time he'd withdrawn the whip from Jeremy Corbyn and had done a number of things to upset the apple cart in terms of purging elements from within the party. Membership of the party went through the floor and so on. I found myself having to write to the General Secretary in my capacity as the Treasurer to say, look, these are the things we've got a problem with, or I've got a problem with, sorry, as the Treasurer. As is my right as a national officer, I'm entitled to write to the General Secretary. So I did. And I listed all these things I thought were wrong. You know, in terms of the way he treated Jeremy Corbyn, whatever we might say or do about Jeremy Corbyn, he's a decent enough man and he didn't need to be treated the way he was. Anyway, it's quite a long letter. Went before the executive. I presented it. I introduced it to the executive committee and got very, very little in response. Very little traction. One or two people, well, we've got to give him a chance and all this sort of thing. I mean, so, okay, fair enough. So knowing that I wasn't going to get anywhere then, I left it. And then we had a conference, I believe, that was postponed. So 2020 had no conference. I think 2021 didn't either. And so it was the back end of 2021. Back end of 2021, we had our conference in September in Birmingham. And I was in Birmingham at the same time, but I wasn't there to be part of the TSSA annual conference. I was there for what was a trade union event run by the Workers' Party of Britain, which is a party I'm no longer a member of. But I was running a weekender with my colleague, Comrade Terry, from the Class Consciousness Project. We set this all up along with another comrade from ASLEF. So I was in the area. My colleague was moving a motion at conference that I had put through my branch, motion number 68, as it was, on the 2021 conference agenda. And it had a lot of a quite a long preamble. I won't go into all the preamble, but it was basically the letter that I wrote to the General Secretary to say there's something very wrong with the way Sir Keir Starmer is conducting his business. but I'll give you the two resolutions. And they're very simple, very simple. Conference instructs the Executive Committee to, 1, convey the terms of this motion to the Labour Party, and 2, to commence a consultation exercise with members on our association's future relationship with the Labour Party. Those were the two resolutions. Very clear, very simple. That was passed in September 2021. To date, neither of those resolutions has been carried out, particularly the second one. The consultation exercise that was required by the carrying of that motion, and it was carried in 2021, was that the membership was to be consulted on the future relationship with the Labour Party. And the hierarchy of the union fought tooth and nail to stop that from happening. And that was part of or one of the reasons, I should say, why I found myself falling out with TSSA and the following year leaving entirely. Because no matter what you say, no matter what you do, be it at the Flora conference or at branch level or at regional council level, if it's to do with the Labour Party, they will not do it unless it's supporting the continued affiliation of TSSA to the Labour Party. They will not countenance anything that will challenge that affiliation. They will not accept it. And the terms of that motion that was passed in 2021 to this day have not been carried out, and they won't be carried out. They won't. So it was that fealty to the Labour Party, that continued almost slave-like adherence to Labour Party policy, to their slavish adoration of the Labour Party, no matter what they did, no matter who was in charge, no matter what policies they did, no matter what policies they binned, was part of a process that saw me leaving the union in July of 2022. The next sort of pillar, if you like, of things that made me leave was identity politics. Now, TSSA is not an outlier in this. The entire trade union movement has become beset by identity politics. So that is the politics based not around class, but of characteristic, be it your sexual orientation, your sex, your religion, any other characteristic you can think of. You develop a politics around those things and not around class. And I've always been a strong advocate for class-based politics at any level in any organisation that's trying to create change. And the trade union movement, and TSSA is no exception, decided that they were going to bin class politics. They weren't going to have anything to do with that anymore. And instead, they were going to go all in on identity politics. And there are a number of reasons for it. But I think fundamentally, the reason that trade unions have gone all in on building identity politics, as opposed to class politics, is because there are too many people, and I don't apologize for using the phrase too many people. There are too many people in the trade union movement and in trade union bureaucracies who aren't working class. And so creating class politics is complete anathema to them. And let's be clear about identity politics. Identity politics are bourgeois ideologies. It's a bourgeois ideology. This is why identity politics has pervaded the media, why it's pervaded the academia, the police, the judiciary, the NHS. All the pillars of civil society have gone all in on identity politics, and the trade union movement has done the same. And no one in the trade union movement is willing to countenance building working class power anymore. They're not interested in building working class power. They're more interested in going all in on identity politics, knowing that in reality, identity politics is politics that's created to do absolutely nothing to change the system. Nothing at all. It gets people very wound up, depending on which of these identities that they belong to. And obviously, you've got the other phenomenon, intersectionality, where you cross the borders of each of these identities. But ultimately, identity politics is the politics of doing and changing absolutely nothing, whereas class politics is the politics of creating change. And that's why the trade union movement don't want to know. That's why they don't want to get involved with it. They would much rather talk about class politics as something we used to do while going on about gender identity, LGBTQ rights, race, religion, sex, and all those sorts of things. They put those higher on their list of priorities than they do class. And that was a big problem for me in the TSSA. Now, I did move unions in 2022, and I moved unions to another union that was just as all in on identity politics. But one of the reasons why I left the TSSA was because they'd gone all in on identity politics, even though there was absolutely no material change brought about by identity politics that they could show me and say, this is the victory that we've won for this group, that group, or the other group. And the whole point of identity politics, the reason why I say it's bourgeois ideology, is because it works handsomely for the bourgeoisie. It keeps the working class divided, antagonized towards each other, and atomized. And that's exactly what the ruling class want. They don't want us setting aside our differences of race, religion, sex, gender orientation, whatever you want to call it, and say, if you're working class, you stand shoulder to shoulder with me and I'll stand shoulder to shoulder with you. They don't want that. They want us to hate each other for our characteristics, hating us for what we are, hating each other for what they are. Well, what we are, sorry. So identity politics was another key reason why I decided that perhaps my relationship with the TSSA was coming to an end. Excuse me for a moment. Okay, the next one, I've written it down here on a little document, and it sticks out like a sore thumb because you might not know what I'm talking about when I say Boilermakers. Boilermakers. So I'll try and explain what I'm talking about. So in around about, memory serves, around about 2019, 2020 time, the TSSA developed a relationship with the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers, a United States-based trade union, which I presume represents Boilermakers and others. Didn't know a great deal about the union. Knew about the Teamsters. I think everyone who's got a passing interest of trade unionism would have heard of the Teamsters in the United States, but not the Boilermakers. But my understanding at the time when we made this partnership, this relationship, this understanding, if you like, was it was going to be purely an educational transfer between them and us, trying to learn what they do that we could learn from and vice versa. Anyway, during 2021, round about the time that my term ended, TSSA, with a continuing fall in membership, and by falling I mean when I joined it in 2005 there was 28,000 members, and by the time they went into talks with the Boilermakers it was 17,000. The writing was on the wall as far as the executive committee were concerned. They needed to merge, and the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers fitted the bill. And I remember at the time thinking, well, why did you go to the States? Why did you have to look there? You know, I've always had slight skepticism of American trade unions, mainly because they're almost always manacled to the Democratic Party. And we can have a debate some other time about whether Labour is worse than the Democrats or not. But being manacled to a party like the Democrats was not something I wanted to, or I was particularly infused by, shall we say. But I was talking to members of the executive committee when I was in Birmingham. They were very, very pleased that this merger was on the cards, that we were in talks. But I was still felt myself wondering, well, why haven't we asked the RMT? The RMT is still, whatever the antagonisms between the two unions, the RMT is still a better fit, surely, than a far-flung union in the United States. You know, it was a very, very strange one to get my head around. And there was a groundswell of opposition building amongst the rank and file about this merger, because it looked, at least from the outside looking in, that the union was essentially going to hand the keys to the Boilermakers and goodbye to the head office near Liverpool Street, goodbye to the assets that the union had in terms of shares and stuff like that, goodbye to the money that the union got from High Speed 2, the residual money that they were still waiting for from High Speed 2 for the purchase, the compulsory purchase of the land that the former head office was standing on. And it seemed to people that they were literally handing it all over to the Americans. And this manifested itself in tumultuous debates at branch level, regional level, and at conference level. And in 2022, it came to a head where the staff, who were obviously concerned about their future future employment should the union go to the wall, which was never likely, to be honest. I thought that was a bit of a ruse on the part of the GMB to try and force the merger through, or at least force a merger through, because, you know, unions don't go bust. They don't go bust. They merge, but they don't go bust. So it ended up being that at the end of 2022 conference, which was in May of last year, basically the deal was signed and sealed. It was a goer. We were going to merge with the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers. And again, that was one of the reasons why I decided to leave, because merging with the union after 125 years of continued independence was one thing, but to merge with the Boilermakers, a union that was, as it turned out, not without its own controversies. I wrote an article for the Class Consciousness Project website about their president, who was forced to resign after trousering a load of money and giving his Ukrainian wife a job at the union where she didn't actually do any work. She just got paid. So that came out after the merger eventually fell through, which I'll talk about shortly. But yeah, the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers was never a good fit for me. I always thought that a British, preferably transport union, and if not transport, then possibly a union like Unite, would have been a better fit. But the wishes of the dissenting few went unheeded. Bear with me. So that was the Boilermakers, and the final one, and the moment that I thought I'm done with this union was at annual conference last year in May, where we were 3 months into the special military operation in Ukraine, and the trade union movement, to a man and a woman, was losing their minds over the special military operation in Ukraine, calling Putin an imperialist. He's not an imperialist, and nor is Russia, but that's what they were calling them. And Sharon Graham spoke out in support of Unite members who were blockading ships that had come from the Russian Federation. The General Secretary of ASLEF went on a fact-finding mission to Ukraine with Paul Mason, of all people. So the trade union movement was going all in on supporting Ukraine, despite the fact that the roots of the special military operation go back to at least 2014, if not earlier, that the regime in Ukraine is dominated by Banderists and fascists, genuine Nazis. Didn't seem to bother the trade union movement too much about those facts. And the executive committee of the union put forward a motion giving full and unequivocal support to the people of Ukraine, criticizing very heavily the Russian Federation for their actions, managing to glean over the fact that the Ukrainian government was dominated at senior levels by Banderists and fascists, that the roots of the conflict began in the Maidan coup of 2018. It was backed by US imperialism. Managed to overlook that fact amongst others. And so, not happy with the motion in any way, shape, or form. It dripped of imperialism, absolutely dripped of imperialism. I decided to, through the branch, write an amendment. So I would try and offer some balance to this motion, this wretched motion. And I pointed out all the facts that I've just said about the 2014 Maidan coup, about the Danderists, about the fact that US imperialism is to blame for all this. Debated it on the floor of conference. And while it's not explicitly mentioned in the motion that the executive committee put forward, I distinctly remember the General Secretary in his speech to move it advocating arming Ukraine. And I was sitting there thinking, well, I've been maybe not known it in my mind at the time, but I've been an anti-imperialist all the time I've been active in the trade union movement. I might not have necessarily called myself an anti-imperialist at the time, but my beliefs and my actions were that of an anti-imperialist. And yet here we are, the General Secretary of a trade union in front of a conference hall calling for Ukraine to be armed by the British and the Americans and so on. And unfortunately, my amendment, was defeated. It didn't help, actually, and I must confess. I did the speech from here, where I am now, because I had COVID and I couldn't travel to Sheffield, where conference was taking place. That was very unfortunate and very regrettable, because I think if I'd been in the hall, and I'm not blowing my own trumpet here, but if I'd been in the hall, I think I could have got that amendment over the line. But I wasn't. I was on a Zoom call. So unfortunately, that was defeated, as were amendments made to other similarly imperialist motions. And the problem that I had after I think it was 3 motions that were carried, all blindly supportive of Ukraine, none of which had any nuance in them whatsoever. It was big country picking on little country, and little country shouldn't be picked on by big country. That was essentially what the gist of these motions were. And I was talking to a comrade offline who was also a delegate and calling in from home just as I was. And he said, "What the hell has happened to this union?" I said, I know. I cannot believe in the, 16, 17 years I've been a member of this union, I would sit here, argue with the General Secretary, and he was calling for arms to Ukraine. And it was then that I decided that myself and TSSA were done. Now, that was in the May. I didn't leave until the following July. And the reason for that was very simple. It was because I had outstanding cases going on as a rep that I didn't want to leave hanging, including one which was a personal case for a member who was quite ill. And I wanted to make sure that I got as far as I could before I could draw a line under it and walk away. But I did walk away. And I walked away in July and rejoined the RMT in July of last year. Now, I'll be brief in talking about the last 12 months or so when it comes to the RMT, but I wasn't impressed. And the reason why I wasn't impressed was, for a start, I didn't even get a welcome letter. I didn't get a membership card. I had to chase up their membership department to find out what my membership number was. I didn't get contacted by any rep. Nothing. When I was in the TSSA, I was a branch secretary. When new members came in, we would get them on a report, and I would make a point of sending an email to every single one to say, "Welcome to TESA. We hope you don't get into any trouble, but if you do, here's where you can find us." I got nothing from the RMT at all. I got my TESA, my RMT news every couple of months, but that really was it. And I was bobbing along, no intention of becoming a rep again, no intention of getting involved, but happy to pay my subs and go along. And that was until last month, when the Trade Union Congress held their annual Congress. I never got round to how you got the Trade Union Congress, but there we are. Trade Union Congress is Congress, where Composite 21 was debated. Now, Composite 21, for those of you who don't know what composites are, it's basically 2 similar motions merged into one. So there were 2 motions put before Congress. one from the GMB, one from ASLEF, both on Ukraine, both just as bad. Okay, equally awful. Full support of Ukraine, claiming to be anti-imperialist, claiming to hark back to the days of the Spanish Civil War and the international brigades. I mean, how you make a link between Nazis in Ukraine and the international brigades is quite beyond me, but they tried to do it. And so these two motions were combined into Composite 21. And on the Tuesday of Congress, it was debated and carried overwhelmingly. Now, there were a number of unions that abstained. And I'll mention two. One was TSSA, which by abstaining, I believe, was in breach of the policy that they endorsed the previous year, because they said they were going to back Ukraine to the hilt. And here was a motion before Congress that backed Ukraine to the hilt, and they abstained on it. So they breached their own policy. But the other union that abstained was the RMT. Now, my understanding from my comrade Steve Sweeney, who is quite well connected with people within the RMT, was that the delegation that went to Congress was dominated by members of a group called the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, a rabidly Trotskyite, pro-imperialist, pro-Western group that kiboshed the delegates, took them from a point where they were going to vote against the motion to a point where they were only going to abstain. This from a union that in 2014 at TUC Congress put forward an emergency resolution, which was calling or basically bringing to the attention of Congress their severe concerns about the political situation in Ukraine in 2014. And it was around about the time of the Odessa massacre, where dozens of people were burnt to death in a trade union hall in Odessa during riots that were taking place between pro-Russia and pro-Ukraine sides. So that was the RMT's motion, emergency motion passed in 2014. And here they were 9 years later abstaining on a imperialist motion to support Ukraine in their struggle against the special military operation with no nuance at all. Again, ignoring the Maidan coup of 2014, ignoring the fact that the US backed that coup in 2014, ignoring the fact that 10,000 people in the east of Ukraine have been under bombardment for 9 years and 10,000 people had been killed. Ignored all of that because it was inconvenient for their position. And it was then that I decided, you know what? I'm done with the RMT. After 1 year, little over a year, I ended my membership, which brings me to where I am now. After 34 years as a trade union member, I am without a trade union. I'm not here, and certainly would not want you to believe that what I've said today is an anti-trade union rant. I still believe firmly that the trade union movement does essential good for working class people. If you're a fee-paying member and you get into trouble, in most unions you'll get a rep, and in most unions you'll get a good rep, and hopefully a good rep that will be able to help you. But politically, they are dreadful in 2023. Now, some may argue, and they may have a point, that they've probably always been dreadful. They've had good moments and bad, but the direction of travel has always been in the bad direction for the trade union movement. And they've made God knows how many mistakes. God knows how many. Look at what happened during the miners' strike in 84, 85. Look at the way the TUC and the Labour Party conducted themselves in that dispute. And I'm as convinced as others when I say that Thatcher didn't beat the miners on her own. She had the TUC and the Labour Party backing her up as well. But despite all that, I still think and still believe that the trade union movement is an essential good. I still believe that they are an essential help to people where people are in trouble. They are not without their flaws. They are not beyond criticism, and I will criticize them. And I have criticised them for the last 90 minutes almost. But I'm sitting here now saying to you that I may find myself returning to the trade union movement again one day. I may find myself returning to the fold of a trade union in the future. But at the moment, the way things are, I'm afraid I can't. And I will spend the next few weeks, months, and maybe even years outside the trade union movement after 34 years as part of it. On that note, I will bring this live stream to a close. The time is reaching 9 o'clock. I would like to thank everybody for joining me today and listening to what I have to say. If you're watching this recorded version, then thank you for tuning in and thank you for staying as long as you have. I will say good night for now. If you enjoyed this live stream and you found it useful, please leave a comment in the box below, and we'll possibly do something like this again very soon. But for now, this is Jason from the Class Consciousness Project saying thank you for tuning in and good night.